undefeated, 13-0 out of the Big Ten. Jim Harbaugh missed, what did it end up being, a third of the season?
6 games. Half the season. 6 games. Well, 6 out of 13.
6 games?
3 and
okay.
3.
That's
3 and 3.
True. Yeah. Okay, half the season. But he's back. He was back at the Big Ten championship game. He's back for the Rose Bowl. Alabama snuck in at number 4 after beating Georgia in the SEC championship game. 12-1. That one loss on the year came to Texas in Tuscaloosa. They get in over Florida State, unbeaten ACC champ. Over under in this game, 44.5 points. Michigan is favored by 1.5 points. Kind of been that way since it opened. I think Michigan might have been a 2-point favorite when it first began. And fun fact from producer Cam is 92% of the bets so far are on the over in this game. This one also tons of interesting matchups, position groups, individual players, strength on strength, some questions about some weaknesses. I know we're going to get into the JJ McCarthy conversation a little bit later, but let's start in the trenches in this game as well. Max, you mentioned that people thought Michigan might win the Joe Moore Award again. They've won it a couple times now since it started, but instead that goes to Washington. You still have one of the best offensive lines, though, with the Wolverines. They're deep. Sam, how do they match up against Alabama? And then flip it the other way. How do those teams match up? Alabama's O-line, Michigan's defensive front.
I really like this matchup for Michigan because they are still really good. They still have really played an elite level, even with the injury. This is not a traditional Alabama front that is just stifling, that will suffocate you. And we talked about it earlier when we were talking about the Sugar Bowl. Texas is the team that went and pushed this Alabama front around. And so it can happen. Even when you watch the win over Georgia, you watch early in that game, big touchdown run, you watch the interior line push some of those guys around and open up some lanes. So if I'm Michigan, I am leaning on my strength here. I'm leaning on my run game. I'm leaning on my own line, and I am trusting them to go win this game for me. And that's one thing when we saw Michigan last year in the semifinals, that was one thing that struck me is I felt like they got a little out of character. I remember, I'll never forget the first drive of that game against TCU. They had a goal to go situation, and we've got Philly special going on at the goal line instead of running behind our then Joe Moore award-winning offensive line. Don't get cute, stick with your strengths, and go run and go see if you can get the ball Donovan Edwards, Blake Corum, and win the game with your strength. That if I'm Michigan, that's what I'm doing.
So I had a quick response to that because I think it's an interesting comment with the way that Michigan has run the ball this year versus the way that they were last year, because I think we were all shocked with how they played TCU. But the thing that's been missing in most of their games has been an explosive run game. Mm-hmm. So Blake Corum has a zillion touchdowns on the season, but they're all like within the 5-yard line. They're short runs. If you get 3rd and 1, 4th and 2, like they can get that. But can they break off big explosive plays? That's been a question. And Donovan Edwards hasn't been very impactful this season. I think he is an X factor in the game because he can be a pass catcher as well. But if you look at where this team ranks nationally, long rushing plays, 30 yards or more, they are scrolling, 73rd in the country. They don't have that many of them. They only have 6 plays of 30 yards or more on the ground. So they are not that, you don't have that home run threat, it feels like. They did against, in like 1 or 2 games, maybe 1 game. Against Ohio State, there was some of that. But there really wasn't in any other game. So I'm curious about that, even behind a great offensive line.
Also against America's best defense, they rushed 34 for 66 against Iowa, which is slightly concerning.
Yeah, look, I mean, we've seen Michigan on the big stage here, and they have not been able to do in the trenches what they are purported to be able to do. TCU rushed for 6.4 yards per carry last year. It was better than Michigan. Remember the talk coming into the game? Big 12 team, they can't run the ball, that kind of stuff. Then turned out TCU could run the ball. So, I'm always kind of curious on these big stages what Michigan can do. And our producer Cam put some really interesting numbers here in the document. So Iowa blitzed only 20% of the time in that Big 10 championship game. 3rd lowest Michigan had faced all year. They had the lowest yards per play of the Jim Harbaugh era. 3.3. Wow. They allowed 4 sacks. Look, Zach Zinter's out at right tackle. that's a big loss for Michigan
Yes.
side. And they have major issues at the tackle position. Alabama's front, not what it has been in the past, but I don't think Michigan's front is what it has been either.
And just to underscore that point, Florida State, one of their big talking points going around Selection Sunday was that their offense has outperformed Michigan's offense down the stretch with their backup quarterback. So yeah, there's a lot that needs to get fixed. And JJ McCarthy also obviously wasn't playing as well down the stretch and without Zinter as well. Let's flip it over though as well, because Alabama's offensive line also not what we typically think of when we think of Alabama's offensive line. This is a team that is allowing more sacks and pressures than we are used to seeing. 43 sacks on the season, which ranked 115th in the country. They were better down the stretch, and they were definitely better at giving Jalen Milroe the time that he needed to make things happen against Georgia. But Max, what are you concerned about, or how do you see that particular matchup going?
Yeah, I think that if you give Alabama a month to prepare for this game, I think, or sorry, if you give Michigan a month to prepare for this game, and do legal scouting, all that kind of stuff. Like, I think the thing that they're going to circle probably is can we find some weaknesses on the Alabama offensive line? And they started a true freshman, Caden Proctor, 5-star recruit, and he got better later in the season, but really was among the leaders in terms of sacks allowed by a freshman this season. Really had some struggles early on. Some teams were able to get him. So I think they're going to be able to, I think Michigan's going to pinpoint some spots here where they're going to try to apply some pressure, especially on critical downs. And, I think the Alabama piece too didn't have Jason McClellan in the SEC title game. Like, I think the run game, you've got good options, but you don't necessarily have like a monster there. So I'm interested to see in that same conversation, like, where is that kind of consistency in terms of turning out yards on early downs? And, I like the backs they've got, but is there a guy that's going to go run for 200? Probably not. It's going to be a team effort there against the Michigan front that, certainly did not get beat by very many people. And as I have tweeted about 100 times this year, really, they were not letting anybody even get inside their goal line. You know what I mean? So I think it's going to be interesting to see. Bama's going to take their shots. Obviously, it's a kind of boom or bust sometimes with that Alabama offense. But can Alabama go get the physical stuff against them? Is going to be it's going to be interesting to see in terms of tone setting in that game. Can they do that consistently?
That line
ahead,
was
Chris.
a turnstile early in the season.
Yeah.
Remember that the Alabama-Texas game? Every single time Jalen Milroe was dropping back, he had no shot. He's running for his life every time. The USF game after that, it has gotten a lot better. And so I think if you look at the stats around Alabama's offensive line, it kind of doesn't tell the whole story. They allowed 8 sacks over the last 5 games. Only 4 of those were against Georgia. So like it did get a lot better, but there are holes. It's a very young offensive line against a Michigan defensive front that is very experienced, seniors and juniors across the board.
I think some of that too is just maturity for Jalen Milroe. Obviously being a first-time starter, there was a lot of growing pains early there. He's going to take some sacks at times and make some decisions that probably are not in sync with the plan. And this is too at times been a feast or famine group in the passing game where they may have some negative plays, but they also may beat you with a 50-yard bomb over the top to Jermaine Burton. You talked about the explosive plays earlier, Nicole. This is an area where Alabama really does have a shot if they can give Milroe time, because they do. It may not be the receivers that we saw 5 years ago at Alabama, but it's still a pretty good group.
Yeah, the numbers on real quick. The number on Caden Proctor I mentioned, he played probably his best game against Georgia, but on the season, 33 pressures, 11 sacks allowed at left tackle there. So interested to see how Michigan focuses in on him.
Yeah, another guy to watch as you talk about kind of some of those big plays. Mike Sandersill, he's the heart and soul of the Michigan defense. Feels like he's always
plays.
He felt like he always came up with a big interception, and obviously he's got a receiving history, so he often great hands and ran back a lot for impactful plays too. So let's fully shift the conversation to Jalen Milroe and JJ McCarthy. These quarterbacks, a little bit different than the 2 quarterbacks that we were talking about in the first semifinal. Feels like they were moving in different directions towards the end of the season because, as you guys mentioned, Jalen Milroe was improving. He was getting more confident. He was making better decisions down the stretch. JJ McCarthy had his worst performances down the stretch of the season. Those were also Michigan's most challenging games. Like, their schedule was very, very backloaded. But I'm curious, when you guys are looking at this game and like someone's going to need to make a play or someone needs to control the game, someone needs to make good decisions, where you lean or where you think about this or how you view these strengths and weaknesses of these quarterbacks. Max, let's start with you, and you can start with either guy. But I'm very curious to see how they both perform on this stage, which, by the way, JJ was in last year and played poorly against TCU. And then Jalen Milroe has not obviously played in a semifinal yet.
Yeah, I think that as great as Penix is, and he's unbelievable. I imagine if you polled the coaches in this playoff, some of them might circle Milroe as like the guy they're maybe the most afraid of, because just the dual threat. Like, if he were to level up in this playoff, then Alabama's got a chance to win it all for sure. And I think that. Sorry, go ahead.
He is one of the fastest quarterbacks I've ever seen.
Yeah, his dual threat upside, if you take out sacks, he ran for 705 yards this year, 41 first downs, 12 touchdowns, just really explosive. And I think that, I'm curious to see, I think Tommy Rees did a nice job over the course of the season of adjusting to, here's the throws we want to go for with Jalen Milroe, and let's not throw the ones that he shouldn't be throwing, right? And I think that certainly, if you spend a month on Alabama and you're, Michigan's defense, they're going to, try and put him into some spots where it's not just about applying pressure, but can we make him make some throws that maybe are more low percentage throws for him? So I'm curious to see. I bet his confidence is going to be pretty high rolling into this, and I think that escapability. I think Texas did a good job of accounting for it. Sam, with Anthony Hill as the spy. What do you do if you're Michigan to kind of make sure you've got a guy accounting for that? And then JJ McCarthy, like, I don't know how long you guys want to talk about JJ McCarthy, but he's like kind of, he's kind of
Chris
like
is
that,
like warming
dynamic.
up. He's getting ready.
Dynamic.
Chris just tossed off the warm ups. Yeah, he's ready to go. Is he like the X factor of the playoff? He kind of is, right? I don't know.
Look, there are times when you look at JJ McCarthy and you think that's QB3 right there. Like, he potentially coming out for this year's NFL draft. There are times when he makes throws that are unreal. His ability to throw on the run, very strong. And yet this year, he's done nothing, like nothing of note. And especially down the stretch. Yeah, they won those big games at the end of the year. He threw 8 passes against Penn State. He threw for under 150 yards in the last 4 games. And, he completed at least 70% of the passes in 3 of those games. So, like, he wasn't losing you the game, but he wasn't winning you the game. And so, like, some people think he's maybe banged up a bit, might be hurt a little bit, and that's why he wasn't moving as much. Or maybe a month later, a month out from the Big Ten championship game, he's just healthy and it'll be a new him. But, they probably beat TCU last year if he doesn't throw 2 pick sixes.
Yeah.
When he has not been asked to win them a game in his career. And that will probably have to happen in this game. Now, I know people point to the Ohio State game last year. Yeah, he had a couple of deep throws. It was like, that's it. It wasn't like he was out there making throw after throw after throw to win you the game. I'm fascinated to see what he does in this game because I think he's got all the talent in the world. Like, you see it. But in the biggest moments, either he hasn't stepped up or this year, they haven't put it on him. They haven't asked him to go out and win the game because maybe they haven't needed to, but they're going to need to in this game.
Michigan turnover margin. I was going to say real quick, Michigan turnover margin plus 17 this year. So at least they're taking care of it. And you're right, Chris, that was the backbreaker against TCU was just the turnovers by McCarthy. So he's played clean, but it's a fair criticism for sure.
Do you know how many touchdown passes he's thrown in his last 5 games? 1.
5 games. 1. Yeah.
1. He's thrown 1 touchdown pass the last 5 games. But he has taken care of the ball. And I'm kind of with you guys. You really do see it sometimes. You really see the ceiling with him. Like, I think he's a really incredible talent, but you don't see it all the time. And like you said, they don't ask him to do it. Whereas Milroe has made some mistakes, but I think you see him flex a little bit more often. And so if you go back to the question, who are you picking in this game? If you had to put the game on one of these quarterbacks, McCarthy's more experienced, but I think I put it on Milroe, and I think I'll go back to the dual threat ability because that I think is such a game changer for them. Even though McCarthy is really good on the move and I think can throw it on the move, but if Milroe is, I think, with what he can do in the run game, to me, I think gives Alabama a slight edge.
There are times when I think of JJ McCarthy, and I like 2 years, 3 years from now, I see him in the NFL starting and playing well, and I was thinking, where was that at Michigan? Like,
yeah. So do you think it's a trust problem, or like
no,
you know what I mean?
no,
Like, I would love to hear what you think on that, Nicole.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to say. I don't think it's like that he doesn't have these skills. I just think the way that Michigan, and this actually gets into, we're going to talk about the coaches as well, but part of the reason that this narrative is that Michigan is built the way that they're built now is built better to win the Big Ten than to contend for a national championship is because they are not really stretching that offense in the regular season. And we've waited for it the last 2 years where they have this really heavy emphasis on the run game saying, hey, well, when are they going to let JJ throw some deep balls and kind of stretch the field vertically and add that wrinkle? Or when is he going to really use his legs, right? And sometimes, he was banged up this year towards the end as well. So some of the leg stuff, but they are comfortable winning low scoring games or games where they are relying on the run game and shorter passes. Like last year, I remember fixating and watching each week, like the average, like the depth of throw for him and how, he was so accurate, like within 10 yards, but then they were barely trying to throw mid-range and deep balls. So I don't think at all this is his skill set. I just think this is the way that Michigan wants to win. And he doesn't seem to care about his individual stats. So like, there isn't really a lot of friction on that. Like he was super happy after the Penn State game when he only threw it 8 times, which you also had an offensive line coach, offensive coordinator as the head coach in that game, right? So I also kind of just put a little asterisk next to that one in terms of the way the game was called and what you're comfortable in a challenging environment against a good defense. What do you rely on? But I think that, Chris, you could totally get that scenario happening where JJ does all sorts of things in the NFL that we didn't even see him attempt at Michigan. And that's why I wonder if we are going to see something different. Michigan has really struggled with the long layoff. They have not been a good team in bowl games under Jim Harbaugh, and they have not played well in the college football playoff the last 2 years after getting there. And we have wanted them to add more wrinkles or add different things that they might have to do to win a game in the CFP era, in the CFP part of the season. And they haven't done that. So that's, I think, the big question. And Sam, I think that speaks to your point about if you need someone to go out there and win the game, don't you put it on the guy who's shown that he can do that? 4th and 31 to save the season, can do it.
100%. That's and that ultimately, when you get to a game of this caliber with teams that are evenly matched, those are the types of plays and players that make the difference. Is the guy who can make the off-schedule play with the game on the line, and that's where, like you said, I think McCarthy has the ability to do it. I think we've seen some of that. It's just he's not asked to, and Milroe, I think they're a little bit more willing to allow him to do that, even though he's been, had his growing pains this year as well. But it's going to be fascinating to watch these two go.
Chris, I want to hone in a little bit more specifically on the coaching matchup. We've kind of circled around it on some of the, again, Jim Harbaugh's teams in the postseason. We've talked about him missing half the season due to suspensions in the NCAA investigation. Tommy Rees, what he did over the course of his season, his first year as the OC at Alabama. And then, of course, you've got Nick Saban, who has seen it all, won it all, knows how to get the most out of his team, and really has done a phenomenal job with this particular team over the course of the season. So how do you see the coaching matchup, Chris?
You guys know what Jim Harbaugh's bowl record is at Michigan?
Like 1-7.
1-6. Lost 6 straight.
Ooh, yikes!
And the 1 year he won his first bowl game, he's lost the last 6. So for whatever reason, like you said, that long layoff has not gone well for Michigan in games that matter and games that don't matter so much. And so, like, I posed this question on our reaction show. What is how do we view Jim Harbaugh at Michigan if he loses this game? If he is 0-3 in the playoff, and through everything he's done, he beat Ohio State and won some Big Ten titles, but never got them any higher. Like, how much pressure is on Jim Harbaugh in this game, on top of the season that he had where he was suspended 2 different times, and Michigan has received a notice of allegations about him possibly lying to the NCAA about things. Like, there's a lot surrounding him. The NFL future stuff we're talking about too. Like, there's a lot of pressure on Jim Harbaugh here. Not that he would say it, maybe that he doesn't even feel it, but the takes, the narratives about what he has accomplished at Michigan is going to be a lot. And I can't imagine what Paul Feinbaum is going to say if Alabama wins.
The vibe could not be more opposite from last year's Fiesta Bowl, when all week long it honestly seemed like Michigan just did not care what TCU was bringing to the table. Like, just assumed TCU could not hang with them at all. Yeah. Very overconfident. Complete opposite this time.
Yeah, I remember that.
We all saw the reaction on the announcement show.
So I was in the room for that. I do want to give a little context, okay? Because
please do.
Okay, so I was in there. I was doing interviews with the Michigan players and Harbaugh for BTN. So part of it was like, so you see Texas, and there were a lot of like, oh, because everyone, like, nobody knew what 3 and 4 were going to be. So when they saw Texas, they assumed it was going to be Florida State. And there were multiple players doing like the tomahawk chop. Like, they thought those were the 2 teams, and they didn't know which order they would be in. So when it was Alabama, it was shock more so than, oh crap, we have to play Alabama now. It was, we thought we were playing Florida State. So I think people were a little bit too much into that, because
they would have felt a certain way about playing Florida State, though.
Yeah, they would have cheered, whatever. Yeah, like, well, but again, that's why, like, after Texas showed up, they were like, they reacted, because then they're like, okay, great, now we have Florida State. So it was just like there was a lot of emotions going in.
Sounds like disrespect to me, just like they did to TCU.
Spoken like a Michigan State alum, always bringing up disrespect. But to me though, like, that point is an important one where, if they beat Alabama and play for a national championship, like, all of those ghosts or all of those criticisms go away, because it wouldn't be just Florida State without their quarterback. Like, it would be like a real serious team, gold standard program to beat, to actually get over that hump. And it's like, this is the one thing that they haven't done. He got over the Ohio State hump. They won Big Ten titles, and then they've face planted at this stage. So it would be different even than if they beat TCU last year. I think people would still be like, it was TCU, right? Because so many people were just overlooking TCU. People are still talking. People were using TCU as an example of not wanting to put Florida State in the playoff, even though that was the championship game matchup, because people like forgot that they actually won a game in the semifinals. It was a whole thing. But I think that this is a better opponent or a matchup from those standpoints of, like, you will be focused. You will not overlook anyone. You have a whole month of preparation. But then, of course, Nick Saban also has a whole month of prep to prepare for you. Right. So that's a whole separate thing as well.
Here's the thing. What if Michigan loses 3 straight semifinal games, 2 of which they were the favorite in? Like you could say, oh, if they beat TCU, whatever. That TCU loss last year was terrible.
But Chris, what are you saying? You're saying people.
I'm saying if Michigan loses this game, do we reconsider them as a top 5 program in the sport? If they have gone this 3 years in a row beating up on a bad Big Ten, you beat Ohio State, and that's
then they would talk about him the way they talk about Lincoln Riley. Probably.
I was going to say that they would get there.
Exactly. That's exactly what it would be.
Yeah, but people still would put Oklahoma in the preseason top 5 and pencil them into the playoff.
Roll their eyes at it and stuff like that, and talk about how great the defense is if they give up a bunch of points, because they got pantsed by Georgia 2 years ago, and that TCU loss last year, to see what happened in that national championship game and to realize that TCU team beat Michigan, that is inexcusable for a Michigan team that was on top and favored going into that game. And yeah, Alabama theoretically is a much tougher opponent. It's a team with a bunch of national championships. But if you lose to a 4-seed Alabama that early in the season nobody thought was going to make it here, like, that's a bad loss. And by the way, we need to all apologize to Alabama. None of us picked Alabama to go to the playoff in the preseason. None of us did. And after that,
or the midseason.
That's right, the midseason too. Yeah.
Well, hey. Yeah, but hey, the committee did what they were actually supposed to do. I'm just saying,
we all counted out Alabama that loss to Texas, the USF game, still one of the most baffling games I've ever seen in my life. This is one of the best coaching jobs of Nick Saban's career, easily. And if this team, the team that barely beat USF, beats Michigan to go to the national championship game, like, he's already the greatest coach of all time. This is just another one you put on the trophy shelf there. That would be incredible.
And to your guys' point, Paul Feinbaum probably will be there. I'm sure he'll be on set and having a show, and he can interact with Jim Harbaugh directly.